During the course of the next half an hour or so, I'm going to talk you through some of the key findings that are in a research publication that we published a summary version, which some of you may have got from outside the front earlier this year. And this week we're putting the full 20,000 word report live on our website. So over the course of the next half an hour or so, I'm going to try and summarize 20,000 words into considerably less than that. So in terms of the subject that we're discussing tonight, so why did we undertake to study this topic in the first place? Well, as a researcher and a journalist, you always want to do something that is meaningful, impactful, and ideally something that can help inform policy and practice and be relevant to the needs of the society in which you are based. And I think when you look at issues around cyber safety, online privacy, and data security, it's impossible to open a newspaper or look on a website most days without finding some story or other related to this subject. Here are just some very recent examples. Secondly, as you can probably tell from both my accent and my teeth, I'm British. And in my research there, one of the things that was really interesting to see was that often we find very similar concerns and attitudes towards some of these subjects around cyber safety and privacy online, even though the kind of markets that we might be looking at are incredibly different. So here are just two examples, one from a report that came out a couple of months ago in the US and another one from the UK, two very established markets with very high levels of internet penetration and high levels of confidence amongst internet users. Yet, when asked questions around their concerns about safety of doing particular types of transactions or how much they consider and worry about privacy issues, you can see that actually the percentages, even amongst established internet users, are incredibly high. And this reinforced findings that we found in a 2011 study conducted by the World Economic Forum, which looked at 15 different countries around the world with different stages of internet development, and found that actually there are often very consistent values and attitudes that can be found from amongst internet users, even though they might be from incredibly different countries and cultures. So we thought this posited a really interesting hypothesis to say, okay, are we going to find the same kind of thing in the Middle East? And one of the things that we were particularly attracted to was the fact that this study here, which was produced by INSEAD and the Oxford Internet Institute, Oxford University, didn't cover any countries in the Middle East in it at all. So we thought the next time that they decided to run this survey, this gave us an opportunity to actually test the same questions and to do that in the Middle East, and thereby give us an opportunity to compare the experience of attitudes of internet users in the Middle East with other parts of the world. And that then gives us a really interesting comparative data set and also gives us an opportunity to explore questions that had never been asked before. So that was very much our background and then and the kind of reasons why we undertook this project. So in terms of how we did it, for those of you who are interested in the kind of methodology, because this is a survey of internet users, we did it via an online survey. And we worked in collaboration with the people who had previously done the World Economic Forum study in 2011, Cornell replacing INSEAD because the lead investigator had moved from INSEAD to Cornell. In terms of the field work, this was done by Comscore and Toluna, who are two of the leading market research companies in the world. And this was our sample, so just under 3,000 internet users across the Middle East, with users representing 14 different countries all included into that mix. So this allows us to look at the data both in terms of overall MENA picture, but then in turn being able to split that further into a sample for the GCC and North Africa. And where you see figures that I'm going to go through later and also in the report, which talk about a MENA aggregate, that also includes some of those other countries, particularly the Levant countries in here. So we have GCC, North Africa, and then a combined MENA figure in our findings. Then, as I mentioned, one of the advantages for us and one of the reasons we were really keen to undertake this project was the fact that it also gave us an opportunity to benchmark the experience of internet users in the Middle East with other people around the world who are also online. So alongside our 2,800 odd people in the Middle East, we also had another 8,500 internet users who answered exactly the same questions, and they were from 44 different countries. So that then gives us a fantastic global sample of over 11,000 internet users covering nearly 60 countries. And then in terms of the areas that we studied, the areas broke down into 5 specific areas. We looked at usage of ICT and technology that was available in the household. Then we looked at attitudes towards the internet, concerns of internet users, trust in different online actors and online players, and then finally I looked at the behaviors of internet users to try and see whether what people actually do online reflects some of the concerns and trust issues that they might have expressed. So in terms of the kind of headline findings for us, we did find, and one of the things we say very clearly in the report, is that actually the Middle East region is less of an outlier than perhaps you might think. There are a lot more similarities in the attitudes and behaviors of online internet users than perhaps we thought when we first started. But nonetheless, there are some considerable differences. And these were the kind of 5 key things that we picked out from our data set. The first, and this may come as no surprise if you live here in Qatar, and particularly if you've also come from countries like the States or Europe or Australia, would be to find that actually e-commerce here is much less prevalent than it is in other markets. In fact, within the region, people are less likely to engage in e-commerce than they are in any other of the regions that we surveyed. They're also amongst the least likely to bank online, so traditional methods of shopping and banking still remain very popular. Secondly, when we explored attitudes towards the internet, we found that internet users in this region were overwhelmingly positive about the impact that the internet could make on their lives, and really felt it was a source of positive input and potential change to them, their families and their countries. And we saw, a huge variance in the figure in the Middle East compared to other regions. We also asked questions around what sort of role government authorities and public bodies should play in terms of blocking content or taking preventative measures to stop inappropriate material reaching end users. And perhaps not surprisingly, in this region, internet users were much more in favour of government authorities playing a strong role in that space than we found elsewhere. That said, we found that internet users here were less concerned, considerably less concerned in fact, about the safety of their personal information being kept online. We don't quite know why that is. This was done pre-Snowden, so post-Snowden, if we retested this data, we might find a very different kind of attitude to this. It could also be that some of the more high-profile security and data breaches that we've seen around the world over the last couple of years have tended not to come from this region, but from the States and North America in particular. So that might be one factor. Or it could also be that actually internet users here are just less aware about the kind of information that's being collected about them, and indeed how safely it is being stored. And then finally, we also asked around questions around data repurposing. So this is around you providing information for one particular use and it then potentially being sold on to multiple third parties. And we found that philosophically, internet users in this region were very strongly against that principle. So even though that is a fact of life for most internet usage, it is something that internet users in the Middle East and North Africa really did not wish to see taking place. Then I also mentioned that we have the opportunity within our data set to explore differences between the GCC and North Africa. Unsurprisingly, given some of the different economic status and between the different regions, that's a driver between some of the differences that we saw. In particular, people in the GCC are much more likely to access the internet on the move. Given smartphone penetration in the region, that's probably not surprising. Smartphone penetration is over 70% in Saudi, UAE and Qatar, whereas it's something like 2% in Egypt. So the ability to access internet content on the move, much easier if you have a smartphone, and clearly much more prevalent. Similarly, in the GCC, there was a much greater level of access to advanced digital technologies such as tablets, gaming machines and so forth. And the impact of that is such that actually it's quite profound. You can see the differences there, almost double in terms of tablets and not much less than that in terms of gaming machines. So when I go on shortly to talk a little bit about some of the overall aggregated regional figures, You have to remember that the GCC answers actually skew the regional figures, so there are greater discrepancies in terms of access to technology than the headline figures might suggest. And then lastly, we also saw a big difference in North African internet users and those in the GCC in terms of the attitudes towards the safety of the information that they put online. So I'll just whiz through the 5 sections that I mentioned earlier and kind of pick out a key headline from each of those. This then is the aggregated figure for technology in the Middle East. So as you can see, compared to the world average, which is the figure in sort of lilac purple there underneath, the region does pretty well as an aggregated figure, but of course there are differences between GCC and North Africa households. I think for me one of the most interesting things here is when you look at satellite TV and cable TV, this figure comes to well over 100%. And this kind of reinforces a finding that we're seeing in a number of other markets where people are not necessarily just taking one platform to be able to access TV. They're often mixing and matching across different platforms. So in the Middle East, this will mean that some of the content that you can access on satellite, you can't necessarily access on cable and vice versa. So some households will deliberately be taking a decision to have 2 different ways in which they can consume TV. And of course, you can also add video on demand and so forth into that mix as well. We found that in the region, VoIP had the highest level of take-up compared to other regions, which was quite interesting, particularly given that certain countries, VoIP is extremely hard to be able to access and to use. And then in terms of the attitudes towards the internet, I mentioned earlier that we found people in this region were overwhelmingly positive about usage of the internet. Now, that's probably not overly surprising, given that this is a survey of internet users. But you do find some discrepancies amongst that, and those who are least positive tend very much to be older, perhaps have less educational qualifications, and tend to use the internet less. So I think it reinforces that this is very much an experiential medium, and the longer you are online, the more, both in terms of years of usage and also how frequently you use it, the more you tend to view the internet as a positive force for good. And again, that finding in this region is reinforced by research in other parts of the world as well. This then is just the slide which just shows you that high level of difference between positivity towards the internet in this region compared to elsewhere. And then I have a couple of slides about the role of government authorities. And I think what was striking here was just to see how much more positive people in this region were about government authorities playing a strong role in terms of blocking inappropriate content and content that they thought might potentially be damaging. So this slide here shows you the figure in yellow is the world average around those who totally agreed, which is the strongest possible statement towards the role of governments blocking content that could be harmful for children. And the MENA figure is 12% higher than the world average, which is very sizable. We've got almost 2/3 of the people who were surveyed expressing the strongest possible opinion that government should play a role in terms of blocking content that might damage children. Similarly, when we asked the question around content that could be deemed racist or discriminatory, we found a similar kind of split. Again, numbers not quite so high, but you can see again in this region there's a very strong sensibility that government authorities should play a role in blocking this kind of content or censoring it so that inappropriate content doesn't reach end users. In terms of levels of concern, probably no great surprises that people in this region are very concerned about their accounts being hacked. That was broadly in line with the experience of internet users across the world. Similarly, there were some concerns around being misled by false information and also reputational damage, although slightly less so here than perhaps we might have expected. But in terms of the areas where people were less concerned, I think there's some interesting kind of media literacy elements to this, perhaps. That there was, our audience reflected that they were much less concerned about being monitored online, about what they did, and also a lot less concerned about the data that was being collected about them. Now, with this, one of the challenges with this kind of research is it often throws up more questions than answers. So we're following up with this research with a number of ancillary projects, which I'll talk about briefly at the end. And some of those explore attitudes to privacy and how that shapes particular behaviors and evolving behaviors. I suspect that data collection may well be one important area in that mix, because whether you know it or not, huge amounts of personal data are being collected about you every time you use a search engine, you visit a particular site, you engage in social networking activity and so forth. But most people are fairly unaware of the consequences of that. So I suspect that if audiences in the Middle East knew more about that, they might express higher levels of concern. And I think that the reason for that was when you look at these questions around data repurposing, and the dislike for that kind of activity and behavior, the two don't quite correlate, perhaps because there is a lack of understanding about some of the information that's already been collected about you. So there you can see, the big difference here in this region compared to elsewhere in terms of reusing data that you have put online. In terms of the different online players in this mix, we also asked people in our survey who they trusted online. And this threw up some really interesting and perhaps unexpected answers. So the highest levels of trust were for organizations and entities who I've deemed offline first. So this is organizations with whom internet users perhaps have had a long and established relationship, and that might be one of the reasons why they have a higher level of trust in them. So that includes your telephone operator, government authorities, and interestingly, banks and financial institutions. Coming from the West, where banker bashing is a very popular sport, to see the high levels of support and trust in banks and financial institutions in this region was perhaps something of a surprise. And then similarly, we're finding that there are much lower levels of trust in organizations who are perhaps newer and are digital first. This chart shows you that, and also shows at the top that actually the level of trust in terms of shops and department stores in this region is very low. And that might also be another one of the reasons why e-commerce activity in this region is as low as it is, that actually the entities who are engaging in a lot of this activity are perhaps not trusted as much as they are elsewhere. Finally, in terms of internet behaviors, we were curious to then explore whether some of the attitudes and concerns that had been previously expressed in the survey then reflected themselves in terms of how people behave, because often they don't. So, I mentioned right at the beginning that there are concerns in the States and the UK and elsewhere about privacy, about shopping online and so forth, but it doesn't necessarily preclude people from engaging in those kinds of activities. So provided that the need is there or they can see a particular benefit, we find that consumers are actually happy to put their concerns to one side and engage in particular types of online activity. In this region, we found that internet users, about 50% of them said they were extremely careful about what they did online when we asked them to kind of rate themselves in terms of how safe they were and what their attitude towards online activities was. But then when we said, do you engage in any of the following activities, and listed a whole load of things that were completely unsafe, they all said, oh yeah, we do that. So we found a really interesting discrepancy there. So examples of perhaps typically kind of unsafe behaviors that people are engaging in, and where perhaps the risks are not necessarily fully appreciated, around things like opening attachments from people they didn't know, scanning your computers or mobiles for viruses, and also a very high, a much higher level of friending people online, presumably through social networks, who you don't necessarily know offline. And we think one of the reasons for that might be some of the cultural challenges of meeting different people, and the online space perhaps removes some of those barriers. So that could be one of the reasons why people are more likely to friend people online than perhaps happens elsewhere. So in terms of the kind of takeaways from that research, I think for me there were 5 key things that emerged. The first was the equivalency in terms of technological access as a regional figure compared to the rest of the world was pretty good. And in fact, actually, if you look at the GCC, there is a much higher access to technology than there are in many other parts of the world. We found that internet users are extremely positive about the impact of the internet on their lives, very supportive of the role of government authorities playing a role in terms of supporting a safe online experience for them. And then, as I mentioned before, very high levels of trust in terms of the relationship that they already have with a number of offline providers. And I think as we try to move more towards a digital economy and a digital society, the role that those additional bodies can play in terms of supporting that transition could be immensely powerful. It's not just about online players trying to encourage people to do more things online and to do so safely. There are opportunities also for these offline entities or people with whom they have an existing strong relationship to support that transition process. And then in terms of what happens next, I've listed here 5 kind of things that I think are on the horizon that are also worth thinking about and considering. The first is, it's pretty clear that some of the issues we've talked about in terms of trust, concern, and so forth, they're not going to go away. And in fact, new technology will bring with it new challenges and also new opportunities. So one good example of this is the Internet of Things. Depending on which sources you believe, there will be somewhere in the region of 20 billion connected devices worldwide by 2020, and all of your devices will potentially be talking to one another. Now, that's either a digital utopia or a digital dystopia, depending on your view of the world. You can probably guess which of the 2 camps I'm in. Presents huge opportunities, I think, in terms of connected devices gathering incredibly useful information about your behavior and your particular needs, and using that to shape and perhaps nudge you into doing things in different and more positive and constructive ways. Yet at the same time, if you have that number of connected devices, there are huge security risks there. The more devices you add, the more the number of security risks that you are potentially exposed to. And particularly when you look at some of these kind of smaller domestic appliances that are going to have connectivity built into them, people are not necessarily really thinking about the security implications of that. And this was manifest in a survey that was published a couple of months ago, which actually talked to just under 2,000 consumers who describe themselves as being digitally savvy. So these are people who are early adopters, they're very pro-technology, they are probably, if not quite as excited about the Internet of Things as me, they're working on it. But 7 out of 10 expressed a very strong level of concern about security when it came to multiple connected devices. Wearable tech. This is, we saw last week the launch of the Apple Watch, and we've also seen a number of other devices that are also either present or going to be coming out soon. The most high profile of these, and the one that's probably raising the most red flags, is of course Google Glass, and what some people are referring to as personal surveillance equipment. This is not available in this region, and Google have said that there are no plans to bring it out in the Middle East anytime soon. But what we've already seen in San Francisco and Seattle and a number of kind of tech hubs on the west coast of the United States is that there is a lot of concern about people surreptitiously recording things in the social setting and so forth. And so you are getting public venues, from restaurants to cafes and bars and so forth, already banning people coming in to venues wearing this kind of technology, because there's no ability for you as a user to control your privacy or what's being captured about you in that space. So I think this is potentially a huge issue on the horizon. Drones is another one that kind of excites me but also scares me. So as a journalist, I'm really excited, and someone also who's into photography, I'm really excited about the kind of opportunities that personal drones afford in terms of being able to create great pictures and great images that are otherwise just not possible. This image is an aerial photograph taken in Moscow in 2012, and it shows some street protests that were going on at that time, and you can just see the scale of what was going on the street. And I've seen wedding photographs that have been taken with personal drones and all sorts of stuff recently. So this is an area that is becoming increasingly affordable and has moved very much out of the military space and into something domestic and industry-led. There's a couple of pictures here also from a fantastic video, and I'll tweet the link later on tonight or tomorrow, of a video a guy shot over Beijing using a personal drone. And these are just some fantastic high-resolution pictures that are coming from there and giving you a sense of the city that otherwise would not be possible. Unfortunately, he got caught by the police and put in prison for taking this video. But of course, for every there are also opportunities that also arise. So every action has an opposite reaction. So just as there might be threats, some people will also see opportunities in this space. And we're starting to see startups who are trying to take control of the data space and giving you, the user, an opportunity to own your own data and potentially make money out of it, rather than people making money out of you. Finally, we're also seeing new services and applications that are addressing some of the privacy concerns that we've already seen expressed. These include new types of encrypted mobile phones and other types of apps like Confide, which does things kind of Snapchat-esque type way, but doesn't allow you necessarily to do screenshots in the way that some Snapchat add-ons do. And then lastly, of course, if all else fails, you can always take matters into your own hands. This was a case we found in the States where, I won't name the small town, but you can probably guess roughly where in the US it was. There was a lot of distrust and disquiet about the ideas of drones capturing information and recording things that they didn't want to see. So there's a man with a gun and a hat. Taking it out. So in terms of our work at the ministry, well, we too believe that you should take things into your own hands to some extent. I'm not suggesting shooting down drones, but we do think that as users you do need to take some responsibility in terms of empowering and educating yourself about some of the ways in which online organizations work, and equipping yourself with the right skills to be able to perhaps mitigate some of the risks and concerns that you might have. So we have a dedicated website, safespace.qa, which provides lots of training materials and information for children, parents, and teachers. We tweet lots of interesting material and case studies and kind of little snippets and tips to help you be safe online. And as I also mentioned earlier, one of the things that this research project really threw up for us was a lot of questions that we wanted to explore in more detail. So we have 3 different projects that are on the go at the moment, which I think will present some really interesting findings, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about and share with you in future months. So one of those is around how children in Qatar use ICT. We found that when we looked at the under-16s here in Qatar, there was a huge interest in understanding what they do with technology, what they access, where they access it, why, understanding how they learn about being safe online and so forth, but zero evidence base to support any policy or practice in that space. So we thought that this was an opportunity to do some really interesting research there that would be of huge value to a wide range of different stakeholders. Similarly, in terms of social media, there's a huge level of interest and a huge level of activity on social media in this part of the world, but it's also a space that moves and changes incredibly fast. One of my colleagues said to me the other week, Instagram, that's so 2013. So we're looking at Snapchat and WhatsApp and Path and a number of these other networks, not just to look at the take-up and penetration of these networks, which is typically where most research, that's about as far as they go, but to really understand what is driving people's behaviors through social networks. Particularly, we think that the privacy settings that one finds, particularly in Path and Instagram, are a huge source of appeal for why people might be migrating away from Facebook and Twitter and using these emerging networks instead. So this is really taking some of the themes that we've seen earlier tonight in terms of being safe online, attitudes towards security and data privacy, and then applying those kind of principles into actual more specific behaviors, particularly around social media. And then we also think e-commerce in this space is another area that we wanted to explore in more detail, because when we did preliminary research into that space, we found that, for example, there are not necessarily the high levels of trust that we thought we might find with online retailers, but also real concerns and risks around fraud, about being ripped off, about credit card security and so forth. Now, that's a theme that we've seen consistently over a couple of years. But what we've never managed to understand yet to date is what are the sources of those concerns and anxieties? Are they rooted in having had a bad experience, or are there actually kind of more deeper cultural underlyings to those concerns? And it's only through understanding that we'll be able to then put in place programs and policies and practices that will encourage more people to take up and take advantage of the opportunities that digital technology provides for them. So that's it from me for now. Hopefully that was a useful, quick canter through a very extensive research document. Thank you very much for your time, your patience, and for listening.